This program is brought to you by Emory University.
All right, guys. If y'all could take your seats, we'll go ahead and get started. I feel like I'm teaching class. These lights are awful. They're right in our face. Sorry about that. Oh, yeah, that makes sense. All right, well, it's me again. It's good seeing everyone. I want to thank you again, Lois, for those really inspiring and wonderful remarks. I can't really think of a better segue into our next panel, Environmental Law Clinics, the Secret Weapon of Saving Our Planet. And a special thanks to Sam for coming up with that panel title name. It's pretty great. I just had it as Environmental Law Clinics, which wasn't nearly as catchy. Like Lois said, like Lois herself, environmental law clinics are dedicated to seeking to protect and restore our environment for the benefit of the public, especially those communities disproportionately impacted by environmental harms. For those of you who don't know, environmental law clinics are essentially public interest environmental law firms, housed within law schools and staffed by law students and law faculty. This kind of unique setup allows law clinics to provide important free representation to clients that would often otherwise go unrepresented, including those clients that we were discussed just a few minutes ago when Carrie Powell asked the important question about who are the organizations that can help these communities if it's not the Big Ten. I think today we'll explore if there's a role for environmental law clinics in conducting that important work. In addition to conducting this work, clinics do something else. They train the next generation of environmental attorneys. They allow students the opportunity to learn by doing, to get out of the classroom and into the field. While there are nearly 50 environmental law clinics at law schools across the country, each has its own focus, its own mission, and its own area of expertise. My hope is that today our panel will provide concrete examples of the different ways environmental law clinics can be structured, the different issues they can tackle, and the different victories they can achieve. And with this diverse viewpoint, we can then explore together the different ways environmental law clinics can be leveraged in the future. I'm joined today on this panel by three incredibly accomplished directors of environmental law clinics. Above me is Wendy Jacobs, the Emmett Clinical Professor of Law and Director of the Emmett Environmental Law and Policy Clinic at Harvard Law School. Next to me is Pat Parenteau, Professor of Law and Senior Counsel at the Environmental and Natural Resources Law Clinic at Vermont Law School. And then Seema Kakade, Assistant Professor of Law and Director of the Environmental Law Clinic at University of Maryland School of Law. Each has accomplished so much in their careers that it would take me almost the entire allotted time of this panel to list their accomplishments. So instead, I'm going to encourage all of you to read about them in your programs. And a quick note about Wendy, as I hope is pretty obvious, Wendy is joining us remotely today. I'm sure all of you are aware our government has shut down. That has made travel quite difficult, and many critical TSA agents are no longer at work, including many in Boston. So while we'll miss Wendy's physical presence here, her remote conferencing, I think, gives us the perfect opportunity to explore on this panel the role of environmental law clinics in an era of decreased federal engagement. It also allows me to say to Keenan, wherever she is, that this conference has a decreased carbon footprint. And special thanks to Wendy for allowing me to say that. So a quick note about how this panel is going to work. I'm going to allow each panelist 10 to 15 minutes to discuss their clinics, their work, their idea of environmental law in the future. I'll then pose a couple questions myself and then open it up to you guys for Q&A. There's two microphones on either side of the aisles, or there will be. Oh yeah, they're there. I ask that you ask your questions into those microphones. That way Wendy will be able to hear you and can then engage and answer. So with that, Wendy, can you hear us?
I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing, but I heard you say my name just now, so is it time for me?
It is time for you. Take it away.
Okay, great. Well, good morning, everyone. Lois gave a wonderful presentation, and I don't know if she's still there, but I wanted to thank Lois for her inspirational courage and persistence. She was actually, and her fight was my personal inspiration for going into environmental law in the first place. When I was in law school, I came to law school thinking that I would go into international law. But while I was in my second year of law school, the Love Canal crisis hit the press and captured my interest. We had no environmental law course here. We had certainly had no environmental law clinic. So I was left to my own devices to learn what I could about environmental laws then. And really RCRA, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, was the closest to a law that would govern the Love Canal situation. But while I was here, Congress passed the Superfund statute, and I actually wrote my third year paper on what's now known as toxic tort litigation. So I was raring to go by the end of law school and went to the Department of Justice to begin implementation of CERCLA and RCRA. So I owe a personal debt of gratitude to Lois for my career path. I also want to congratulate Mindy and the fabulous Turner Law Clinic on her 10th and its 20th anniversary, and I'm thrilled to be a part of the celebration, even though from afar. So as Mindy said, and as you'll hear from the four of us, no two clinics are exactly alike. We may cover different subject matters, perhaps we choose our projects somewhat differently, and we certainly operate somewhat differently, but I think it's fair to say that we all dedicate ourselves to three overarching goals. The first is teaching students. The second is leveraging government and non-governmental organization resources. And the third is engaging with communities. So I'm going to touch on how I address these goals in my clinic, and I'll give some concrete examples of the work we do along the way. So with regard to the first goal, teaching, it's my personal goal in my clinic to teach not just law students, but other students studying related disciplines and communities, the goal being to empower all of them to use the law and to exercise their rights. So my perspective, having come out of both public practice and private practice for many decades before I came to the clinic, to start the clinic, is that lawyers don't practice in a vacuum. We're very reliant on other professionals to make it possible for us to do our jobs effectively. So I want my students to have that experience of working with other professionals and to work on teams with other professionals. So to that end, I encourage students from across our university, whether they're in business, engineering, public health, public policy, to join us in the clinic. So most semesters we do have a multidisciplinary, at least one or two multidisciplinary teams of students. And I'll give you an example of how this works. We are about to embark on a project on behalf of a number of Florida coastal municipalities. This group of municipalities want to find a way to work together to help their communities adapt to climate change. But they have a number of issues they have to sort out in order to do that. Some are policy, some are pure law, some are public health. So we have assembled a team of students, including law students, public health students, and economics policy students, to work together to help these communities undertake a vulnerability assessment, and then to help them develop a governance structure and smooth out the relationship between state and local laws cause to enable them to move forward as a collective. So that's an example of one of our multidisciplinary projects that is really exciting and a fabulous learning experience for the students, but we're also helping this set of communities. The second goal that I think we all share is the ability to, and using our clinics, to leverage the resources of state and local agencies and non-governmental organizations, all of which constantly are in need of help, but all the more so nowadays with the siege on public health and environmental protection that we're all experiencing. So an example here of how we leverage our resources is, many of you, I'm sure, are aware that the Massachusetts Attorney General has been tangling with ExxonMobil. And it's been a very fierce and resource-intensive battle. And it starts at the point of the AG investigating ExxonMobil's practices. They actually tried to they've been fighting the AG on her use of a particular investigative tool. So, and it rose to the Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts. And we in the clinic weighed in with an amicus brief that we prepared on behalf of 4 former attorneys general in Massachusetts. So it is in that way that we're able to help support the efforts of our Attorney General's office. I also, from time to time, will deploy a student to work directly in either the Attorney General's office or in the Office of General Counsel for our Department of Environmental Protection. So that's one way in which we leverage our resources and help both educate students and provide assistance to agencies in desperate need of help in this day of constrained resources. Another example is that more than a decade ago, when I first came to create this clinic, the Secretary of Health and Environmental Affairs in Kansas had issued, I don't know if any of you remember this, but he issued the first ever decision to deny an air permit to a coal-fired facility that wanted to expand its plant. He denied the permit explicitly on the grounds of climate change. He had many other reasons on which he could have denied the permit, but he singled out climate change. When I heard this, I knew he was going to be attacked in every forum in Kansas, federal, state, administrative, you name it. And sure enough, they were. I reached out to him to offer the clinic as co-counsel for his general counsel at the agency, who had to deal with myriad other issues all day long and every day. They accepted our offer of assistance, and it was such a fantastic opportunity for our students to work on briefs in the administrative system, as Lois was saying, to support the permit. In the courts, the lawsuits were filed in federal and state court. We ended up in the Kansas Supreme Court. And in addition, the secretary was summoned to Congress to testify, and our students were able to help him prepare and accompanied him to Congress. So it was such a mutually gratifying and wonderful experience all around. The other thing that we do to help leverage our resources and support those of others is on behalf of municipalities who are struggling often with policy questions about, for example, if they want to impose a net zero greenhouse gas emission requirement on development projects, do they have the legal authority to do that? And if the answer is no, how can they obtain the authority? So we do a lot of policy work as well to support other organizations. The third goal that we all have is community engagement. And for me personally, based on my set of experiences, I've come to really appreciate what a crucial skill it is for young lawyers to be able to demystify the law for other people, for normal lay people, to make the law accessible and to communicate very complex legal material to non-lawyers. You know, I think we've all had the experience of observing law students who enter law school speaking English and then they leave speaking legalese. So I try really hard to catch them while they're in the clinic and help them revert to ordinary English again and really think about how do they analyze an issue and reflect on it and write on it in legal terms, but how can they then translate the work they're doing, the thinking that they put into their work, into plain English again to make the law accessible? So to implement this goal, what we do in the clinic is prepare a number of guides for non-lawyers. So, for example, when the fracking boom took off a number of years ago, we prepared a really nifty little manual for landowners who were contemplating leasing their property for oil and gas development. And the purpose of the manual was not explicitly to say you should not lease your property, but rather to say you need to think about the following issues to make a reasonable decision about whether and how to enter into one of these leases. So again, it was a multidisciplinary effort to lay out the public health impacts, the individual health impacts, to lay out the environmental issues, and then provide information about how to do a split sample, for example, how to enter, what sorts of lease terms would ordinarily be included that are not favorable to the landowner. And we offered advice with the caveats, of course, that everyone needed to hire their own lawyer at some point, but with sample lease provisions that are fairer for the landowner. So that was, again, an exercise for the students to first figure out the legal issues and then translate them into language that would help ordinary landowners. So, and that guide was distributed around the country. And in fact, it was so popular that we had to reissue it several times. Likewise, as Lois was pointing out about the importance of citizen science, I've had teams of students over the last year and a half prepare a guide that is now on a website of its own for helping citizen scientists and communities think about and organize their efforts for starting or participating in data collection and environmental monitoring projects. So the guide is based on a 50-state survey of the laws. We looked at nuisance, at trespass, at ag-gag laws, and we looked at the laws around sampling and evidence. So we looked at drone laws. We looked at the protocols that EPA and agencies require for sampling procedures, put it all together first in a legal document, and then over time the students were able to convert it into a very practical manual for citizen scientists, where we explain the iterative processes that they would go through to decide whether they themselves are undertaking this work to educate the community or to alert a regulatory agency to the need for intervention, or to bring a lawsuit. So now we're at the point where students are actually working on a manual to assist citizens who want to bring lawsuits and need to understand what level of quality assurance and quality control of their sampling will be required for a court or an agency to accept the sampling that they do. So this, again, has been an incredible experience for students to really understand how various facets of the legal system come together to support the ability of a community to protect itself. We also, as part of the community, for us, we think about the academics, the scientists and researchers across our university and other universities in our area who are struggling to understand their own rights, those who sit on federal boards at the moment in particular, and how they can communicate their views of the impacts of chemicals and certain operating practices beyond the technical journals in which they ordinarily publish their thoughts. So we work a lot with academics and local scientists and researchers, and now doctors as well in the Boston area, to comment on permits, to comment on rulemakings, and to get their views more widely understood by the public and, of course, expressed directly to the agencies. It was remarkable to me and our students a number of years ago to learn that a lot of scientists and researchers just assume that EPA is obligated to read the scientific literature. They didn't appreciate that if they don't bring their material to the agency, it won't necessarily be taken into account in the consideration of a permit application or a rule. So, and I guess the last thing I'll say is that in order to make sure that our students have the ability to understand and appreciate what an enormous scope of undertakings environmental and energy law embrace, we do try to have on tap every semester some form of litigation projects, whether it's brief writing or we have students testify in rate-making cases, for example, to promote energy justice. So we try to have some form of litigation work. We have some policy projects and some regulatory projects each semester so that students can experience these three facets of environmental energy law. And we try to have projects in various settings as well so that they can experience and understand that environmental law is not just done at the federal level in DC, but it's done at the local level, it's done at the state level, it's done by NGOs and communities as well. So I think I've probably touched on the key issues in terms of the substance and structure of our clinic. I'm wondering, should we save mechanics for Q&A, Mindy?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. So I'll look forward to questions, and I'm eager to hear from the other two panelists.
Thank you, Wendy. That was really, really, really great. Pat, you want to take it from here?
I'll try. Thanks very much. And thanks for the invitation, Mindy, to come to Atlanta and to finally get to see what I've heard about for so many years, the wonderful work of the Turner Clinic. Can you hear me? Usually people don't have that much trouble hearing me. Usually they're fleeing to the back of the room. And before I'm done, you may do that. And if you finish before I do, that's okay. You can go get coffee. But I mean, the three biggest issues of the 21st century are food, water, and energy. And it sounds like the Turner Clinic is in the middle of all three of those. And I hope all the clinics and all the environmental organizations and all the other community organizations are as well. Those are the three things that will determine the fate of humanity on Earth. That's a small point to make, right? Our little clinic is a lot more modest than that, but we've been around at the Vermont Law School for, I think, 15 years or so. I came up, my good friend Karen Sheldon and I cooked up this idea that Vermont Law School only has 60 courses in the curriculum on environmental law. So we needed one more thing to make sure that we could continue to claim to be the world's greatest environmental law program. Our clinic is a PILF. It's a public interest law firm, and it functions precisely like a law firm. And our first goal is professionalism. and building the professionalism of our students. And right along with that, and embedded in that, is the ethical responsibility of lawyers, certainly to individual clients, the zealous representation of the interests of the client, attorney-client relationship, but really, much more fundamentally, the role of lawyers to be a positive force in the world. It may shock you to know that that's not always the case. You know, the old saying, 90% of the lawyers represent 10% of the people, is still pretty much true. Pretty much true. So I guess we're part of the 10% of people and lawyers and educators who think it's really important to instill in these budding, brilliant, bright, wonderful lawyers to be a larger sense of purpose in life. Why the hell are you here, after all? And when it's over, and as I get a little bit older, I realize it actually will be over at some point. That question looms larger and larger in my life every single day. Why the hell are you here? What are you doing? And why? And why does it matter? And what are you going to leave behind? You know, make the world a better place? What does that mean every single day? In your own life, your family life, your personal life, and of course, your professional life. So I'll tell you a little bit about the way we approach things. We start right off by having students decide which of the matters on our docket they want to work on. And the first thing they have to do is a conflicts check. And it's not a superficial thing. They have to spend 2 days, and they have to think about everything they've ever worked on or done, and they have to look at both the rules of professional conduct. In Vermont, of course, we start with the Vermont Bar Association rules, but then the ABA rules of professional conduct. And we ask, could anybody perceive that you might have a predetermined view of the matter upon which you're about to work? So it isn't just a direct, obvious conflict. It's deeper than that. It's, can you really render objective, professional, high-quality legal advice on the matter that you're being asked to work on? Can you really approach it the way you're supposed to as a professional, without fear or favor, without any predetermined notion of what should be the outcome? Investigate the facts, investigate the law, come up with your advice, and provide that in clear, plain English, as Wendy was saying, to your client. So we start right off by saying, you are a lawyer, you're not a law student. When you walked into our little clinic space, you walked into a law firm, you're a lawyer. We have a bias for litigation that might reflect the views of the founder. I was put on this earth to sue people. There are lots of people who need to be sued. I understand the sweet voice of reason. I'm all about finding win-win solutions. They're not always easily obtained. Sometimes it's because there are people of bad motives. Sometimes it's because people actually fall into evil ways. But most of the time, bad things happen because good people are doing them, because they're part of a system in which that's what you do. And when we ignore the human consequences of the actions that we take in Flint, Michigan, sometimes it's the result of actual criminal behavior. Flint has the record for the largest number of indictments of public officials in an environmental catastrophe. But sometimes it's simply the result of, if I want to get ahead in the company I work for or the agency I work for, I have to do what it looks like it's necessary to do to succeed. And I don't want to really think hard about all of the negative consequences that might go with that. Some do, some don't. So we do quite a bit of litigation. But here's the thing. Litigation is just a tool. Sometimes it's a very blunt tool. It's not an end in itself. And in fact, litigation never resolves anything permanently, totally. It is leverage. It is about leverage. It is about power. It is about a seat at the table. It is about holding government accountable and industry accountable. It is about compensation to victims. It's about all of those things. But it is only part of a much larger campaign, a campaign to change things systemically at the root. And all of our environmental problems, at their root, is the economy. The American economy, now the global economy, the capitalist economy, whatever you want to label it, they're all embedded in our economic model. Now, we can't fix that economic model through litigation and overnight, but we can certainly peck away at it. And whenever our cases involve multiple fora, and they always do, when we take on a matter for a client, I'll give you some examples, we always look at where does litigation fit. We're looking for cases that have good litigation merit, whether it's state court, federal court, formal administrative proceedings, wherever the adjudication process functions. We're looking at that because the skills that we're trying to develop for our Vermont law students are those kinds of litigation skills. We have transactional clinics at Vermont Law School. We have a solar clinic, we have a food clinic, we have a criminal law clinic, we have a poverty clinic, we have all kinds of clinics. We have all kinds of policy institutes. We have an energy institute and a food and agriculture institute. So our students are getting loaded up with policy and writing and research, and they're not getting a whole lot of hard-nosed litigation skills. So we are focused on that. But we realize we had a case involving a mining operation in Vermont. You know, one of the problems with doing environmental work in Vermont is it's kind of hard sometimes to find horror stories. But you know what? We do have pollution in Vermont. We have blue-green algae in Lake Champlain. You don't want to let your dog go chasing balls into Missisquoi Bay in August. No, don't do that. They've died. And let alone, God forbid, kids swimming in places like that. So we do have pollution in Vermont. If you look, you'll find it. But we had this mining operation, and it turns out that my old agency, I was the environmental commissioner for a while in Vermont, passed this rule. Boy, they got it past me somehow, exempting this marble mining operation. You know, Vermont's noted for its marble. When you fly into Washington, D.C., and you're looking down at all the monuments, that's Vermont marble. So this mining company was actually turning it into things like paint and toothpaste and other stuff. They weren't mining dimension marble. We've built all those monuments. But they were using an awful lot of processed chemicals, and one of which had a name I can't even still to this day pronounce. And no studies had ever been done on the chemical. Its profile, its fate and transport was unknown. And so we brought this lawsuit, and we had to go and find expert testimony, and we had to get $50,000 from a funder to buy that testimony, and we had to find out that the profile of this particular chemical was a teratogen, and so forth. Long story short, we knew that this case was going to be challenging the exemption that the state had adopted by rule to allow this operation to continue as not something requiring a lined landfill to dispose of the waste product. But we also knew that we had to change the rule. And to change the rule, we figured we had to change the mind of the administrator, my successor, who was disinclined to do that. So then we had to go to the legislature to get the legislature to change the way this particular law was being implemented and enforced. So a quick example of how you do have to look at these problems multidimensionally. And of course, the media is always constantly a part of that. This particular company that we were suing was the major employer in Rutland County, which is one of our major cities. It was also the major contributor to the then sitting governor of Vermont. And the dean of our law school got the call when we sent the notice to sue the company. What the hell are you doing? Shut this clinic down. And our dean, in a moment of panic, said, gee, maybe we ought to establish a board committee to review whether or not our clinic should be bringing cases like this, and why the hell did I ever let Parenteau do this to begin with? So then we have that little battle to fight, which many other clinics have had to fight, Tulane most famously, but many others, Pittsburgh. And I think Maryland had a case that you might hear about. All right, so that's that. Yet we're also looking for impact cases. So we want students to have face-to-face contact with clients. The most transformative thing about working in a clinic, which is different than sitting in a classroom being bored to death and surfing porn sites, is the attorney-client relationship. That's what transforms the whole educational attorney-client process. When our students are sitting in a room, as they were in this mining case, with ordinary Vermonters, about a dozen of them, concerned about their health, concerned about their groundwater, concerned about the fact everybody in Vermont's on groundwater wells for drinking, concerned in some cases about their farming operations. When the students realize there's consequences if I screw up, it changes everything. When they know that the well-being of these people that you're sitting and having dinner with, and we always have it around a meal. The first meeting has a meal component to it. Same thing when we went to Maine and worked with the Passamaquoddy, very ceremonial dinner. Some of us had to eat dolphin. But you see what I mean, and this echoes Lois. You do have to, embedded in the community is too strong, but you do have to sit at the table in their living room and listen and partake of food and other things before you open your mouth. And then you have to, and then all of a sudden, the research steps it up a notch, and the writing gets much better, and the outcome becomes more clear. And yeah, there are going to be winners and losers, and those potential losers are now my best friends, or at least, if not best friends, clients with a human face and a family to go with it. So that transforms everything. The other thing we're looking for is cases that really do have an impact. If we can change the way a substance is being managed and regulated, we're always looking for that spin-off effect of litigation, or using the litigation as leverage to get a change in rule or to get a change in legislation. We had another case, I'm just throwing out little random things, this is what Parenteau does, where our clients were complaining before the local zoning board, planning board, about a new development. And it turns out the new development was by some rich guy from Texas who had probably made his money in the oil patch and bought a trophy home in Barnard, Vermont. And he wasn't going to, tolerate these local yokels opposing what he wanted to do, so he sued them all. You know what they're called? SLAP suits, strategic lawsuits against public participation. Our clients went to the media, and he sued them for that. They went to the public hearing, the public meeting before the little zoning board, and he sued them for that. He sued them for malicious interference with business reputation and slander and libel, and none of it had any basis, in fact. All of it violated the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. So what? I'm a rich Texan, I got a lot of money, I can hire the best law firm in Burlington, Vermont, and I'll beat you into submission, and I'll make sure that you never sue me again. In fact, I'm going to cost you $20,000 to defend this lawsuit, and then I'm going to make you sign a settlement that promises never to disparage me again, ever. And he did. He succeeded in all that. So by the time we got to the case, it was too late for these particular plaintiffs. So we went to the legislature, and Vermont now has one of those anti-SLAP or slap-back law provisions, which has been tested repeatedly now. It's a fast-track way of having these cases dismissed and having the plaintiffs pay the defendant's lawyer for having the case dismissed. These are the things that our clinic likes to do. See if we can't find a larger remedy to the problem, looking at the symptoms, looking at the core or the root of the problem. And then, of course, climate. There is this thing about climate. And even though we're a tiny little clinic in a law school in a village without a stoplight, that's our claim to fame, and it's true, we weren't founded by Ben and Jerry's, but we could have been if they would have given us any money, and we'll still give them their name if they want to give us the money, okay? Not so much Exxon, but Ben and Jerry's we might live with. So climate. How does a little tiny clinic like ours deal with climate? Well, we do. So we teamed up with, and we like to find cases in Vermont so that our students can sit down with the folks, but we'll go further than that. So we went to Montana, and we represented a group of ranchers. These are serious guys with big hats and boots. I mean, this is, these are real third, fourth generation ranchers, Northern Plains Resource Council. And we stopped, and I'm gonna have to rush along here. Took 5 years, but we challenged what would have been the largest new coal mine in North America, Otter Creek, and a railroad, of course, that they needed to get the coal out of Montana. You'll love this little anecdote. So, you know, it's in the eastern part, the big Great Plains part of Vermont, of Montana, Tongue River country, beautiful country. So this mine was going to be brand new, no infrastructure whatsoever, no roads, no railroad lines, no nothing. So they had to build a railroad, you know, right? Create a railroad to get the coal out of this mine. And originally they were aiming at Wisconsin, right, in the upper Midwest. This was like 10 years ago, or no, it's more than that. It's like 20 years ago when this thing was first conceived. So we're going to open this mine, dig up all this sulfur-compliant coal, and send it to the upper Midwest. Well, you know what has happened with coal, right? Those plants are not even operating anymore. So then the company said, well, I'll tell you what, let's have the railroad go to the west, and we'll send it to Washington State, and we'll build a coal terminal, and we'll send it to China. So if we can't sell the coal in the United States, we'll sell it to China. Long story short, through this arcane agency called the Surface Transportation Board, how many people have practiced before the STB? We never did. It used to be the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission. So we had to learn a whole new, not only body of law, but a whole new entity and organization and administrative process that nobody knew anything about in the environmental community, period. But we did. We killed the thing. It took us 10 years. Coal, the market, economics helped. So that's maybe one of the last things I should say is that clinics, litigation, advocacy of whatever kind, in whatever forum, it's all about buying time. It's all about delaying the bad thing until something changes. The politics changes, the economics change, and you know what? They do. We did the same thing with an LNG facility in Passamaquoddy Bay in Maine that was going to be built on the sacred site of the Passamaquoddy people. And we stopped that, primarily by just delaying it and holding it up until the economics said, you know what? We really don't need another LNG facility in Passamaquoddy Bay. So that's what we do in our clinic. We like the human touch very much. We like the direct personal contact with clients, but we're broad gauge enough to understand that sometimes the answer isn't litigation, you know, to nail everything's a hammer. Sometimes it is a policy question, and sometimes some deep policy work to figure out how to change the way things are currently being administered makes sense. We drafted the ordinance for the city of South Portland, which stopped an export terminal for tar sands from Alberta. The city came to us and asked for our help, and we said, well, the first thing you need is an ordinance, and you're going to have an ordinance that passes muster under the constitutional challenges that will inevitably develop from the Commerce Clause, the Negative Commerce Clause, the preemption provision, and so forth and so on. And this is my last point. We did it, and the court upheld it, and the ordinance stopped the terminal. So we celebrate all these victories. I don't care how big or small they are. I don't care how big the spoon is. We always celebrate them. And of course, the way we do that is with some good Vermont microbrew. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? Great. I'm Seema Kakade, as Mindy mentioned, and I am the director of the Environmental Law Clinic at the University of Maryland. And I should say I'm a fairly new director of the clinic. I have been at Maryland for a year and a half. I left the Trump administration. Before coming to Maryland, I was at EPA headquarters in DC, and I spent over a decade in federal practice, both at EPA headquarters as well as the Department of Energy. So my background is mostly air pollution as well as energy. I did air enforcement for a number of years at EPA. And coming to Maryland Environmental Law Clinic, I'll tell you why I came. The main reason I came is because I had a lot of law student interns over my time in federal practice, and I often thought I also did a lot of hiring for the federal government for environmental lawyers, and I often thought to myself, there seem to be a lot of skills that law students are not coming to practice with. I had students from all over the country, from pretty much every law school, coming through as EPA interns, and it surprised me sometimes how students didn't know what a preamble to a rule was when I asked them to look up a preamble to a rule. I often found myself sort of reminding students that there are 3 branches of government. I sometimes would edit memos with lots of mistakes in them. So I thought to myself, well, let me think about how I can develop a practice and develop some work at the law school, the law clinics, that produce lawyers that know how to do something. You know, my husband is a pulmonologist. He's an ICU physician. And he was an academic professor at Johns Hopkins for about 15 years. And he always used to say to me, you know, you guys don't have a residency. How does that work? Where do the students actually learn how to do anything before they go into practice? Because he went through a 3-year residency, a 4-year fellowship after that, and then became licensed to practice the field of medicine. And we don't have anything like that. And you know what? The clinics are the closest thing that we have to that. And that's what's so fantastic. So I too love the title of this panel, that we are the secret weapon. I think we're the secret weapon for the things that Pat was just talking about the amazing impact and the actual work that clinics do. But my approach and what I actually focus on is less on the amazing impact, even though I think Maryland Clinic, like all the other clinics, have really produced amazing results. My focus is actually what I choose my work on with my clinic is what's going to be good for the student. Because here's the thing, and here's the challenge about clinics. Environmental law takes a very, very long time. One particular student is not there for that entire period of time. They may be there for a semester, they may be there for a year. Okay, so they may not see the wonderful impact that your clinic is having. And so I really approach things as my goal in my clinic is to be producing really solid thinkers, really solid people who can go out and write, really solid people who can do some kind of oral presentation. Doesn't have to be in front of the Court of Appeals, right? It doesn't have to even be in front of an administrative agency. Maybe they're doing an oral presentation for a community group to help that community group evaluate litigation risk because the community group is thinking about potentially taking some legal action. So maybe that's the oral presentation, but developing the confidence for a student to get up in front of a group of people or in front of one person and actually say something, and say something that makes sense, right? Understand how to use the CFR. How do you look up Code of Federal Regulations? So I actually tell my students in my clinic, you think you're coming here to practice environmental law. You think that you are coming here to make a great impact, but I don't think that I can promise that you will make a great impact in a period of 9 months. What I will teach you, though, is all of the other pieces that get you to think about how to be a great environmental lawyer when you actually have the time to do it. And you actually have that job that has a horizon of years, and you've got to figure out how to do it then. So what I do is I take matters where my students might be sending a FOIA request, for example, to an agency. And then they've got to spend weeks on information law. Because guess what? You don't have a case if you don't have information, right? And how are you going to get the information? Are you going to get the information from the agency? What if the agency isn't giving you information, right? What if the agency is withholding? There's litigation right there. but it's in the FOIA context. It's information law. It's actually not under our environmental laws. It's not under our environmental statutes, right? Or we do a lot of work at the really, really local level in front of zoning boards, and then they learn about preemption, right? Is this issue going to be a problem because someone's going to argue that the state has primary authority here, or is it really the local government? So we spend a long time on just understanding preemption. They might be gone before that case ever moves forward, before there's ever a change to the zoning permit for that facility. They might not even know what happens in that case, but my goal is that they understand preemption in those few months, right? Standing. Take a long time to figure out standing, whether you even have the ability to bring an action. So we focus on things that get students to think and understand how to build a case, understand the issues that come up, so no matter what area of law they practice in, they will be better at thinking and better at writing and better at standing up in front and talking to people. Along with that comes, I think, a little bit of what Lois was talking about, which is just listening. I often find that lawyers talk a lot, but don't always listen, and there's a huge, huge advantage to just teaching students how to listen. Because sometimes I often find that students will talk and talk and talk and talk, and they need to take some time to listen because they're asking questions that if they would have listened first, they probably would have discovered the answer already, didn't need to ask. So we spend a lot of time working on listening skills in my clinic, and sometimes we'll go to community groups. The wonderful thing about Baltimore, in many ways, is that we have communities all around us that need to be listened to and don't feel like anyone is listening to them. In Baltimore, we're close to almost a 50% rate of folks living below the federal poverty line. We have at least 40 to 50% of people in Baltimore don't own cars. So even things like if we're meeting with a community group and they're coming to the law school, and I ask a student to contact maybe the community leader, right, and explain on how to get directions to come to the clinic, I'll say to them, remember, don't only give driving directions, right? You got to stop and think that maybe this person isn't going to be driving and you can't give driving directions. Maybe they're not going to be parking in the garage across the street that's $15 an hour, right? You've got to think about this, and you've got to think to yourself, how is this person getting here? And that by itself is a lesson in understanding. It's a lesson in listening. And I had a student ask me, well, how is that applicable in my practice? When I'm actually a lawyer, how is providing directions and listening going to help me? And I tell them a story about how I was at the Department of Energy, and I had to do an environmental impact statement because we had to go through NEPA on a decision that we were making, and it was 3 weeks of NEPA hearings that I had to conduct in the middle of nowhere, Montana, and it was very long, and it was in the winter, and there were a lot of people that were showing up at that hearing, and I had to sit up at a podium like this and just listen. Because I had to receive all those comments, and I had to respond to all those comments as the regulator. And I had to deal with all of those comments from a whole variety of people. And that was me, the lawyer, working in the general counsel's office from DC. Right? I had to fly to Montana and spend 3 weeks just listening. So listening comes up in legal practice all the time, and these are the skills that I think our law students need to understand and need to work on, right? Writing, okay? I love it if in the 9 months that I have a student, one of our matters does go to litigation and they get a chance to work on a summary judgment brief. Fantastic. But that's not gonna happen all the time. The timing just doesn't work out, right? I had a Kolash case last year And it was proceeding towards briefing schedule, and I was just hoping that this briefing schedule is going to lock me right into that February, March timeframe, that sweet spot of second semester when students they've been working on this case, they know exactly what's going to happen. And what happened? The briefing schedule got moved, and arguments, all the briefing was done over the summer when I had no students. And guess when argument was? September 10th. So now I've got to get a new group of students up to speed in 2.5 weeks to do an argument in front of state court, in state court in Maryland. That's not happening, right? So it doesn't always work on the timing for litigation, and so I've really tried to take things piece by piece. So for writing, what I do is focus with my students on all the different kinds of writing beyond that summary judgment brief that people do every day in practice, okay? Emails, right? We do an exercise in class with writing an email. Imagine that you're a lawyer for the EPA. Imagine that you're a lawyer for the Maryland Department of Environment. You've got to write an email to the Assistant General Counsel of that agency, for example, and you've got to brief them on an issue that's coming up, and you've got to get a decision out of that person on whether you can move this way or that way, and you have 2 paragraphs to do it. Go. Just an email. Okay? We'll spend 2 whole classes on just that, right? Or writing something to a client, whether it's a really short memo, right? Or whether you're getting on a webinar and doing something orally across to a whole group of communities. We represent a client in the state that works with community groups all over the country, and they do a lot of community organizing. And so my students will get on to a webinar pretty often to provide legal counseling to a whole variety of community groups that are situated in various parts of the state. And they do this through a state-level nonprofit organization. It's amazing, right, how many students have trouble figuring out, okay, how do I speak on a video conference, right? How do I set up the Zoom conference, and where's the mic, and where do I speak? And so that is just a really phenomenal lesson. And I tell the story about how I had to do an argument in federal district court in Illinois, and the judge did not want everyone to fly out because it was a motion to compel. Didn't think it was worth everybody flying out for a motion to compel, arguing that in district court in Illinois. And so what did we do? We had to do the entire argument on the motion to compel via video. And it was a challenge because we couldn't get the technology to work, and we didn't know where we were speaking. And so that's a skill that I think is very relevant, right? Just figuring out how the camera works and having to speak to people on video. That's how everyday practice often works.
Could you give me some training?
So that's, my point is that I've come to the clinic wanting my students to be able to do great things later, not necessarily great things in their law school experience, because they just don't have the time always. And that summary judgment brief is not going to necessarily be due at the right moment. Now, what I think is really fantastic, though, is getting students to see how that FOIA litigation is going to ultimately create the impact on the environmental side, right? How understanding preemption is going to help create the impact on the environmental side. And we have this phenomenal alumni dinner that we do every year, and students come back, and the students that were in clinic 3 or 4 years ago, we said, guess what? Guess what happened to that piece of FOIA litigation? Here's where we are at. Here's the environmental impact that's happening right now, right? And I get calls from students who were in clinic several years ago that say, I got your newsletter, and I worked on that case. That result you finally got, that's terrific. I have students from the alumni program who come and act as guest speakers. So that's where I wanted to sort of mention in my last couple of minutes is I get asked a lot about what people in the private bar or people from other organizations can do to help clinics. So I wanted to just spend a few minutes on that. I think Wendy alluded to this as well. A lot of our clinics, including mine, work at various levels of government, right? We work on local issues, we work on state issues, we work on national issues. Many of us also, we haven't mentioned this, but many of us work on international issues. Many of us support NGO communities and really, really poor communities in countries all around the world. We're taking a group of students to Guinea in West Africa this summer to do work on mining, to be working on NEPA sort of like processes that are happening in Guinea. So many of our clinics do work at all different levels. And at particularly the national level, I've noticed that my clinic, as well as a lot of others, will work with the Earth Justice, work with EIP, work with Sierra Club, work with NRDC. We co-counsel stuff. They often are, especially now, have way too much work, and they're fighting the big challenges, APA challenges on rules, all kinds of things, and they need help. And so if our students, for a period of time, can help them with working on draft comments, with help them working on a brief, that's a really good relationship to have. You can also time it a little bit better to be when you actually have students as opposed to in the summer. So the co-counseling works really well. So for those of you that are with nonprofits out there, those of you that may need help on things, right? Clinics are great for that. Calling up a clinic and saying, hey, I could really use help on this particular piece of this grandiose impact that we're trying to achieve. Clinics are really, really good for that, I think. And I get calls a lot from former friends of mine who I worked with as a co-plaintiff when I was at EPA, from Earth Justice, from EIP, from NRDC, from Sierra Club, wanting clinic help on one particular piece. And so what I say to them is often clinic directors are looking for work and filling their docket twice a year. And you can imagine what those 2 times a year are, right? August-ish, right? July, August-ish, and over winter break, for those of us that have new students coming in second semester. So calling up your clinic directors, those couple times a year, they're probably in the process of thinking through what they can take on for that semester or that school year. So those of you that are in the nonprofit sector, please call us during those times. I think that that's a really positive thing. Those of you that are in the private bar, I'm in the process right now of, I've got a lawyer that is a land use lawyer in Maryland, and his firm gives them credit for doing pro bono work. So he's taken on a pro bono case in Maryland. Well, here's the thing. The pro bono case has taken way more hours than he originally anticipated, okay? And he's feeling a little swamped. And as luck would have it, they're actually winning, and the company who they're fighting keeps appealing. So it's like the never-ending litigation, which a lot of us have been there. You think it's going to stop, and it doesn't. It's appealed and appealed, or it's in an administrative process and goes to judicial review, and you find yourself in judicial review, and it's appealed and appealed, right? And so sometimes pro bono private practice lawyers take on too much work, and they also can call clinics and get help and get support for the litigation that they're doing. And again, taking on a co-counsel relationship or a consulting relationship is something that I think a lot of clinics are doing as well, going to what Wendy said about leveraging resources. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities for those of you that are in the public sector or in private practice doing pro bono work, if you want to help out with clinics. And there's also just basic help, right? We all want guest speakers in our classes. We all want thoughts on who you might recommend for an expert, either a consulting expert or an expert testifying expert. In one of our cases, if you've got recommendations, that can be helpful. So there's a lot of ways, I think, to get involved and support clinics, and I encourage those of you that are looking for ways to do that to reach out to us, because we are the secret weapon. Thanks.
Thank you all. I don't know, is Wendy back up? There she is. Hi, Wendy. I want to thank all the panelists for, one, such incredible talks, and two, for touching on almost every question that I had thought to ask you guys about environmental law clinics. One thing I wanted to quickly talk about before I open it up to all of you, because I know that having worked with many of you in the audience, you may have different questions about how you can better use the clinics that you have resources for. I know many of you have called and asked how you could help out a clinic and kind of stopped it there. Just, hey, I'm here and I want to help. And I think Seema's comments on how you can narrowly tailor your request is really a good one. But I want to make sure we save time for you to explore those issues more. Before we get there, I want to talk quickly just about how geography may impact clinics' work, especially since we have so many different geographies represented. And so for all of you in the audience, so you can better understand perhaps which clinics may be the best place to go to if you're looking for help in representation or if you're looking to volunteer your help. I know here at Emory, we are very, very fortunate to be located within the city of Atlanta and spend about a third of our work focused here in our city. But Atlanta is also the state capital, and indeed it's kind of the regional capital of the Southeast. And because of that, we're able to explore representations at the state level, policy work with our government, having students make it down to the Capitol, and then work it with federal agencies who are often headquartered here. And so our location really allows us to do that. I talked to my colleagues at the University of Georgia in Athens who say, we wish we were closer to Atlanta because we can't offer those opportunities. And so I was wondering if each of you could kind of talk, I know Pat, you briefly talked about how Vermont doesn't have as many environmental issues as other places. Atlanta is not as fortunate as to be able to say that. But I was curious, and from your perspective, Seema being so close to DC, and Wendy up in Boston. And Wendy, if you can hear us, do you want to go first?
I'm having a lot of trouble hearing. Are you asking us to address the question of how our geographical setting influences the clinic?
Yes.
Okay, so we're here in Cambridge. It's a big university, a big law school. Our students come from all over the country and all over the world. And we're in this very urban setting. So although I want to have projects that are local to our area, I have found over the years that our students are very eager to understand how they might have opportunities to practice around the country and around the world. And I am very blessed to have a wonderful donor for my clinic. So I have the resources to be able to take on projects all over the country. Occasionally we do international work. And I think I heard other speakers, I had a lot of trouble, but I think I heard other speakers saying that they like to send their students out to the setting in which they're practicing, whether it's policy, litigation, community engagement, and I like to do the same. So I try to find projects that allow my students to do fact gathering in the field, as we say, to interact with other professionals, to interact with clients and agency representatives, and to have an opportunity not only to produce significant written work, but also to make oral presentations, whether it's educating citizen science group about how to practice citizen science, what are some of the obstacles and incentives, or we sent students out into communities that were undergoing the fracking boom to speak with communities about their rights. So although we are based in Boston, Cambridge area, we do make ourselves available and take on projects very consciously around the country.
Thanks, Wendy. And I should have said one of the other great things about Atlanta is our airport. So I'm quite lucky that I can send my students across the country as well. And we're heading to Albuquerque, New Mexico on Tuesday. So there you have it.
I guess my answer to that would be geography for us is very different. are situated in Baltimore City, which, as I mentioned, is it's got a lot of issues, a lot of environmental issues that are much more sort of health-oriented, I would say, and really community redevelopment issues. So we work with our small business clinic, for example, on a lot of economic development kinds of issues, health issues, food scarcity issues, things of that nature. But we also have a whole different aspect of the state, which is, we aren't too far from our state capital in Annapolis, but not even so much geography on being accessible to Annapolis as well as to DC. I send my students down on the train all the time to attend public hearings at federal agencies and things. But I think the other interesting thing about our geography is that we have both sort of your classic health and pollution-oriented problems when you talk about the environment, and you also have your classic conservation, natural resources, wildlife issues, which I think are a whole different area. And we also have a lot of energy issues, which I think a lot of people don't even classify as being sort of squarely environmental, but we also have a lot of pipeline issues, a lot of transmission line issues, a lot of those kinds of issues as well. So our geography, I would say, is sort of twofold. One is the accessibility near our city areas, rural areas, as well as the nation's capital, as well as our state capital, but we also have both sort of the natural surroundings of coastal areas, mountainous areas, as well as kind of community pollution and health-oriented areas.
Well, one nice thing about being small is that we have a citizen legislature that meets for precisely 5 months a year, and you can actually introduce and pass a bill in one session. And I always caution our students, I say, be careful when you go testify in the Vermont legislature, because they're likely to do what you ask them to do. So be careful what you wish for. One example, we drafted, Laura Murphy, drafted Vermont's GMO labeling law. And of course it was immediately attacked, and it survived the judicial challenge, but it also prompted Congress to amend federal law to preempt specifically Vermont's law, but to create at least a half-assed, I would say, labeling law. Not as good as Vermont's, but that's an example. I mean, that was our clinic. We drafted the law, we defended the law, we convinced the AG it could be defended, and then, Congress acted. So everything's connected.
Thank you. If anyone in the audience has any questions, we can take a couple, and there are microphones on either side. That would be great. Questions? We do such a good job talking about everything.
Stun them in silence.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you all so much for being here. I'm an alumna of Vermont Law School. Hi, Pat. Thanks for coming. How many VLS alumni are in the room?
Oh, wow.
Woohoo! Can we get a picture at lunch? Okay, thank you. I just had to say that. We're not in the same room very often. I don't have a law degree. I did a master's in environmental law and policy with Vermont, and so I didn't have the pleasure of working in a clinic, but I am practicing sustainability, and I care very much about environmental law and policy, and the role of clinics. So I'm just curious from a longevity perspective, if you all could touch on how you've perceived the role of the clinics change over time. I think you all of the clinics have been around for varying lengths, and I'm curious sort of the impetus for starting each of your clinics, whether it was more sort of student-focused or more solving community challenges focused, and then how you've seen the role of clinics in general change over time and their influence over the impact that they've had with environmental legal issues. Thank you.
I think that's a fantastic question. So, and I actually had a very similar question myself when I came to Maryland Environmental Law Clinic. As Mindy knows, and Wendy and Pat, I think too, when I came to Maryland, one of the first things I said was, well, what are all of the environmental law clinics doing? You know, surely there must be a meeting where all the environmental law clinic directors get together and talk. And apparently there had been one years ago, but it hadn't been recent. And so Maryland hosted a environmental law clinic director meeting / workshop, and it was fantastic. And this year Columbia hosted it, and next year Chicago may be hosting it, and it gives us the opportunity to talk exactly about that. What do people focus on? And I would say, in my view, what I've learned is that every clinic is different, and that's basically how Wendy started, right? That some clinics, I think, really do have a super strong client base, and they've got staff attorneys that help, with the continuity of that clinic for a very long time, and they're almost like, as Mindy described, a public interest law firm themselves with a few clients. And so they're working with those same clients to deal with the long-term problems that a community might be facing or a watershed might be facing. Other clinics, I think, are maybe a little bit more student-focused, and that's the approach that I've taken, as I described, that's focused a little bit more on the student aspect of it. And I think, I think most clinics are trying to do both, and trying to find where the balance is between both making sure students are learning, as well as making sure that the clinic itself is making an impact for communities. It's just the balance might be different in every clinic.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm going to jump in. The Turner Clinic was founded by the Turner Foundation 20 years ago, with an idea that it would have this dual mission, right? Protecting and restoring the environment, but also training the next generation of attorneys. And the clinic has been quite deliberate in the representations that it takes on, in that we see ourselves as filling gaps in the legal landscape. We see the clinic's role as not one, and other clinicians kind of take different approaches, but here we see our role as really trying to help out where help is needed and not pile on where there's already a lot of help there. So we really think that clinics, because of our staffing and because of our resource limitations, have a unique role to fill, and that we do ourselves the most service when we appreciate and build on that uniqueness instead of trying to mimic something else that we're not. And I think over time, I've seen many clinics kind of grow to embrace that model, to be proud of the fact that we can fill these legal gaps, that we of course can take on these really big cases and partner with all the other groups. We can also work with the communities around which we live or across the country who maybe don't have other places to go for this type of help. And in doing that, we're helping our students develop a unique skill set, one that they can take out into the marketplace and say, hey, I've actually had experience doing this, and not many folks have. That makes me different, and that makes me more prepared to do what it is I'm here to do.
I do think that for a clinic like ours in white Vermont, and then we're one of the whitest states in the country, that trying to do environmental justice issues looking at communities of color has been a real challenge. So recently we've partnered with Earth Justice, which has developed quite a robust program focused on environmental justice. And our young, brilliant attorney, Rachel Stevens, is the contact person with Earth Justice, working with a team of, I think Carrie Powell's in the room as well, and she's working with Carrie on some things. So that's new territory for us for sure, trying to figure out how do we appropriately involve ourselves in communities that we don't really have a long-lasting relationship with, certainly haven't built any trust with, and certainly need to do a lot of sort of ground setting. The other thing I'll just quickly mention is all of us in this room and all of the clinics and everybody else are going to have to think about post-2020. And we're all going to have to confront the damage that he will not be named has been doing and is continuing to do. And, you know, I've been doing this stuff for 45 years. I know I don't look it, I understand, but it's true. And I've never seen this level of institutional damage before in my lifetime. And it's not over. So The positive thing is, with every crisis, there's a challenge and an opportunity. So we're going to actually have an opportunity post-2020 to take a serious look at environmental law in America and maybe begin to address some of the systemic problems that Lois has mentioned and everybody has mentioned. We are nowhere close to dealing with the existential threats to life on Earth, folks, with law. It's pitiful how far we are from what we need to be doing to confront these challenges and what we are in fact doing. And it isn't just law and litigation, I understand. It's politics, it's campaign finance, it's a whole complex of things. But let's begin now to think about rebuilding, revitalizing, building back better an environmental system of laws and institutions and capabilities. These threats are becoming more and more manifest. That's an opportunity. More and more people are beginning to realize just how important environmental protection, protection of public health, protection of families, protection of children really is. So let's seize on that moment. It's a kind of a dark moment, but let's seize on it and make some lemonade out of it.
Good morning, everybody. This has been a great learning opportunity. I'm Lindsay Harper, Executive Director of Georgia WAND, and I had a question for Wendy. You mentioned earlier a report that your students had put together. You looked across the nation, monitoring and testing, and we're working with communities in Burke County where they're building a nuclear power plant, Vogtle, and that would be a great resource if you could just share a little bit more about how you all put that together and also how possibly we could get our hands on it. That would be super helpful. Thank you.
Wendy, I don't know if you could hear that question. I'm going to repeat it to you. It was a question from a woman in the audience who's with Georgia WAND, and she was curious to learn, one, more about your citizen science guide that you published. She would like to know, one, where she can access it, but two, if you could tell her a bit more about how you pulled it together.
A bit more about what?
How you drafted it.
So I didn't hear the question at all, but I can give you the website, which is citizenscienceguide.com/homepage. So that was citizenscienceguide.com/homepage. You could also find it on our clinic website, but we created a website exclusively for the guide because we are expanding it. I think Mindy asked about the genesis of the guide, and it actually has a very interesting backstory, which is that about 2.5 years ago, I got a phone call from a scientist at a local university who was in Wyoming collecting environmental samples for the purpose of turning them over to a government agency, writing about a problem and then urging an agency to take action. She learned in the field that there is a law in Wyoming that penalizes, they have a heightened level of criminal trespass liability for anyone who accidentally or intentionally crosses private property with the purpose of collecting environmental samples to turn over to a government agency. So she heard about this while she was out in the field and called in a panic to ask, am I going to go to jail for doing, what I consider to be my job and civic duty? So, I couldn't believe there would be such a law, but lo and behold, Wyoming had exactly that law. So we very quickly advised her, and there was no time to bring a student into this because she needed to know urgently. So my staff and I quickly researched it. We advised her about what to do and how to avoid falling into the trap of this law. But that set me to thinking, gee, where else in the country are there laws that either impede citizen science or incentivize it? And which laws intentionally have this result and which just, accidentally have this result. So that's what led to the 50-state survey of a variety of laws. That in turn led us to think about legal reform. So going back to Pat's points about trying to fix the system, we are in parallel with the guidance for citizens preparing model legislation for states whose laws, in fact, impede citizen science, but the state doesn't necessarily intend for that consequence. So we're drafting some model legislation, but this guide has come out of the notion that neither professional scientists nor citizens are aware of all of the possible pitfalls. So we looked at loitering statutes. We looked at stalking statutes. We looked at trespass and nuisance. And then we looked at the evidentiary laws in each state, so that we've now assembled this guide to help citizens think about the various purposes of the work in which they're engaged, and then think about what quality assurance, quality control of the sampling they're doing is necessary for their various purposes. And as I mentioned earlier, coming out of the effort of the guide that's now on the website, we have prepared in the fall semester a guide for citizens who want to litigate these issues, and we will be posting that guide. What happens in our clinic, I'm sure, is common in other clinics, which is students do fabulous work, but their work needs some refinement. So at the end of the semester, we double check, we refine, we polish their work before it's actually published. So the guide that's on the website is polished. It looks very professional because we were able to hire a graphics person to help us. And we are updating periodically the legal analysis and the 50-state survey so that it remains current as well. I hope that answered your question. If not, Mindy can let me know there's a piece I missed.
No, that was perfect. Thank you so much. And actually, this is a perfect way to end this panel. I want to thank all of you. Oh, sorry, Diane, I missed you. The lights are in my eyes. Diane has a question. We can't leave without asking that.
I'm Diane Curran. I have the honor and the joy of working with Mindy on a number of cases, and we've been working together about, it must be almost 10 years. And I know from our experience that Mindy has gone up against some of the big industrial giants of the state of Georgia. And my question for the panel is, and it gets back to what Pat was saying about how economics is so important to everything. Seema, you work for a big state institution. State legislature, I'm sure, has a role in funding the University of Maryland Law School. Mindy, you, I'm sure, have a huge number of big donors to Emory and Emory Law School, and maybe not so much for Pat. I don't know about Wendy's situation, but I'm guessing that you all have situations where you get a case and there's some really powerful state or business interest that's involved maybe in making donations to your institution, and you've got to navigate that. And I just wondered if you would comment on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, you have to go first.
All right. So several people know that this was a major issue at Maryland for a number of years. So in Maryland, this was under our former director, did take on the poultry industry in Maryland and ran into all kinds of issues with the state legislature, who was very concerned about that. And it is definitely a reality for public universities, right? Even things like, I mentioned FOIA a lot. FOIA is my favorite thing in the world, by the way. But, even things like FOIA, we're subject to public records in the same way that a state agency is. And so when we're taking on cases and we're taking on matters, and we know that we could be subject to public records, and we have to be really careful about attorney-client protections on those documents in the same way that any other state agency would. So being a public university, there are a lot of things that we need to sort of think about. And I think it's very true with even the donors. I mean, we've got, on sort of both sides, I think I've seen where donors who want to give money back to the school will say things like, you aren't doing enough. You should be, I'm funding, I want to give because you're going to be taking on the poultry industry. You're going to be taking on this and this and this. And then other times you get the exact opposite. And so I do think that it is a challenge that clinics do face, and you have to navigate those issues on a case-by-case basis, really.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think different clinics across the country over the course of the last 30 or 40 years that there's been environmental law clinics have faced various different levels of pushback from donors, from state legislatures. I think private institutions are a bit different than public ones. Here at Emory, I've been incredibly fortunate to have wonderful support at the university level and at the law school level for our work. And when there has been the occasional pushback, they have stood up and said, this is an important academic pursuit. We think that this work is important to conduct, that our students are learning. But I should also say we do have an advisory board. Many of my awesome advisory board members are in the audience here today. And the purpose of that advisory board, and many, if not most environmental law clinics now have advisory boards, is to get a group of really, really smart people on all sides of the issue into one room, and we discuss potential matters with them. We're thinking about taking this on. What do y'all think? And we look for their opinions, their insight, and their approval so that if and when we do take on a case that turns controversial and funding or some other thing is brought to the attention of the university can say, hey, there was a group of people who all thought this was a good idea, right? We're not saying this company is bad. We're not saying you've done anything wrong. We're just saying that this is an issue that had merit and it was at least worth exploring, and that has been a pretty successful model for us. Do you have anything to add? Wendy, do you have anything to add about pressure from donors or from the state regarding controversial representations?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I remember one of the things that's so phenomenal about the clinical community is when University of Maryland was attacked by the poultry industry and there was all that pressure, a number of other clinics stepped in to help pick up the cases as the university was struggling. So at Harvard, obviously, we're a private university, so I don't have any of those public pressures. Interestingly, and I'm sure everyone would appreciate being such a big university. We have this enormous endowment for the university, many, many, many donors who are running companies that we oppose in the clinic. Harvard University's perspective is that each of our clinics operates independently of the university. So when I first arrived coming out of the private sector thinking about conflicts, my first impulse when I wanted to engage in some issues with Walmart was to go to the general counsel of the university to clear any potential conflicts. And their answer to me was, we don't worry about it. What we do is our business. What you do is your business. The two don't come together. So I've been really fortunate that I'm not constrained by donors to the university to do the work that we do in our clinic. My donor is incredibly supportive and has made it possible for me to operate in ways that even other clinics at the law school are not able to, because he has given us enough money to make us free to do our work and to do it very competently. So I am really lucky and grateful that I am not constrained. And in fact, very interestingly, a number of NGOs and the University of California Law School, and we participated in a joint effort to develop comments on one of the Trump administration's most obnoxious rules. They're all obnoxious, but this one in particular, we brought our forces together, and Exxon is now, because Exxon can't come after me in my clinic, they're going after UCLA to get information conversation about another matter because UCLA, it's a matter that involves my clinic. Because Exxon can't come after me using the Public Records Act, they're going after UCLA, and it's raising this specter again of how do the private clinics at private universities, how are we able to interact effectively with our public university counterparts? So that is becoming a challenge with which we need to grapple.
Thank you. Really great question, Diane. I'm so glad I didn't cut you off. All right, so we are going to take a break now. There is lunch right outside. The lunch has been catered by Emory Dining and features a whole bunch of local farms that we use here on campus. There should be signs letting you know where they are from. There's also a photographer out there, so for those of you who have found or reconnected with old friends and want to get pictures taken, I encourage you to do so. We'll be back here at 1:30 for our next panel.